World War I is taught as a war of empires, trenches, and tragic loss. That version is real, but it's incomplete. What's missing are the facts that didn't fit the narrative, the details that were classified, censored, or quietly buried in military archives that remained sealed for decades. This isn't about conspiracy. It's about control. The industrialized nations that waged the First World War understood something crucial. Public morale depended on selective truth. What follows are 20 documented realities from the war, each one disturbing not because it's shocking in isolation, but because it reveals how normalized human expendability became between 1914 and 1918. These aren't myths. They're recorded in medical journals, declassified reports, and soldiers' diaries that were never meant to be published. And together, they form a picture of the war that was deliberately kept from view. The first reality involves something called trench foot, but not the version you've heard about. Everyone knows soldiers got trench foot from standing in water. What's rarely mentioned is how advanced the condition became before treatment was even considered. Medical officers documented cases where the flesh of the foot had begun to liquefy, where gangrene had set in so deeply that amputation couldn't save the leg because the infection had already entered the bloodstream. Soldiers were expected to remain in position even as their feet rotted inside their boots. The smell was so overwhelming that officers could identify infected men from several meters away. In some British units, trench foot was treated as a disciplinary issue rather than a medical one. If you reported it too early, you could be accused of malingering, a charge that carried the possibility of execution. So men waited. They waited until their toes turned black, until the skin peeled away in sheets, until they physically could not stand. Only then was evacuation considered. The mortality rate from secondary infections related to trench foot was never officially published, but hospital records from field stations suggest it was far higher than combat injuries in certain divisions during the winter months of 1916 and 1917. This wasn't an anomaly. It was policy. The second reality is about lice and the typhus they carried. Soldiers on all sides were infested. That's known. What isn't widely discussed is the lethality rate once typhus took hold in a trench system. The disease spreads through louse feces, entering small cuts or being rubbed into the eyes. In the close quarters of a trench, a single infected man could spawn an outbreak that killed dozens within 2 weeks. The fever reached temperatures high enough to cause permanent neurological damage. Men became delirious, attacking their own comrades, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination. German medical reports from the Eastern Front describe entire companies incapacitated not by Russian bullets, but by typhus, with survival rates below 30% in units where the infection spread unchecked. The solution wasn't better sanitation, it was isolation. Infected men were often left in sections of trench that were then abandoned, essentially quarantined to die without using up medical resources. This was written into German field manuals as accepted practice by 1915. On the Western Front, British and French forces did similarly, though the language used was different. They called it triage. The result was identical. The third reality concerns gas warfare, specifically mustard gas, and what it did to the human respiratory system over time. Immediate deaths from gas attacks were relatively rare compared to the long-term casualties. Mustard gas doesn't kill quickly. It blisters the lungs. It destroys the mucous membranes. It causes fluid to build up in the chest cavity over days or weeks. Men who survived the initial exposure often drowned internally, alone in field hospitals, struggling to breathe as their lungs filled with liquid their bodies produced in response to the chemical burns. What makes this disturbing isn't just the suffering. It's that by 1917, all sides knew exactly what mustard gas did. They had the medical data, they understood the timeline of death, and they kept using it, not because it was tactically decisive, but because it created a specific kind of terror, and because it incapacitated more men than it killed, which was seen as strategically useful. A dead soldier is one loss. A dying soldier occupies medical staff, transport and resources. The math was explicit in internal military communications. Mustard gas was efficient not as a weapon of death, but as a weapon of systemic burden. The fourth reality is about the execution of soldiers by their own side and how common it actually was. Over 300 British soldiers were executed for cowardice, desertion, or refusing orders during the war. France executed around 600. Germany's numbers were lower, closer to 48, but their criteria were different. Italy executed at least 750. These weren't battlefield decisions. These were formal courts-martial, with paperwork, witnesses, and legal procedures. The condemned were usually shot at dawn by firing squads made up of their own units, men who had fought alongside them. In many cases, the executed soldiers were suffering from what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but at the time was called shell shock or simply cowardice. The British Army didn't officially recognize shell shock as a medical condition until late in the war, and even then, it was treated inconsistently. Some men were sent to rest stations, others were sent back to the line, and some were shot. The decision often came down to the individual officer's judgment and the needs of the unit. If morale was low and an example was needed, a shell-shocked soldier became that example. The families of executed men were told their loved ones died in action. The truth was classified. It wasn't until the 21st century that some of these men were officially pardoned, nearly 100 years after their deaths. The fifth reality is the use of soldiers as mine canaries, literally. Before major offensives, especially those involving underground mining operations, commanders needed to know if enemy tunnels were close to their own. The way they found out was by sending men into partially dug or unstable tunnels to listen for sounds of digging or to trigger collapses that would reveal enemy positions. These men, often drawn from disciplinary units or those already marked for punishment, were equipped with minimal support and told to go as deep as possible. Many were buried alive when the tunnels collapsed. Others suffocated when ventilation failed. The practice was widespread enough that British, French, and German engineering corps all had informal names for these men. The British called them listeners. The Germans called them moles. Their casualty rates were never included in official mining operation reports because technically they weren't combat deaths. They were classified as industrial accidents. The tunnels under the Western Front were a separate war, fought in darkness, and the men who died there were erased twice. Once in the collapse, and once in the records. The sixth reality is about starvation, not in the trenches, but in the cities. The British naval blockade of Germany, which began in 1914 and continued even after the armistice until the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, caused the deaths of an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 German civilians from malnutrition and related diseases. This wasn't incidental. It was the strategy. The blockade was designed to starve Germany into submission by cutting off food imports. By 1918, the average caloric intake for German civilians had fallen to less than 1,000 calories per day, well below survival levels for sustained periods. Children were particularly affected. Tuberculosis rates among young people skyrocketed. Rickets became endemic. There are photographs from German hospitals in 1918 showing children who look like famine victims, their bones visible under skin, their growth permanently stunted. The blockade continued for 8 months after Germany surrendered because the Allies wanted to ensure compliance with peace terms. Food was used as a weapon, and the civilian cost was treated as acceptable leverage. This was discussed openly in British Parliament at the time, and the decision to maintain the blockade was defended as necessary. The deaths were anticipated and considered worthwhile. The seventh reality involves battlefield amputations and the lack of anesthesia. In field hospitals close to the front, especially during major offensives when casualties overwhelmed medical staff, surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia or with only minimal pain relief. Chloroform and ether were in short supply, reserved for officers or for cases where the surgery was complex enough to require the patient to be still. For many traumatic amputations, the procedure was done with the soldier awake, held down by other men, sometimes biting on leather straps. The screaming was so constant in some field hospitals that medical staff developed psychological symptoms of their own. Nurses reported nightmares, auditory hallucinations of screaming even when off duty, and in several documented cases, complete psychological breaks that required them to be removed from service. The speed of amputation was prioritized over precision. A limb could be removed in under 2 minutes if necessary. The survival rate for these amputations was lower than those performed with anesthesia, not because of the surgery itself, but because the shock and trauma often led to cardiac arrest or fatal infections. This wasn't malpractice. It was the standard of care when resources ran out. The eighth reality is about animals, specifically horses, and how many died. Over 8 million horses were killed during World War I. They were used to haul artillery, carry supplies, and transport the wounded. They died from shell fire, gas attacks, exhaustion, starvation, and disease. In the Battle of Verdun alone, an estimated 7,000 horses died per month at the peak of the fighting. When a horse was injured and couldn't be saved, it was shot and left where it fell. The bodies were usually stripped of anything useful: saddles, bridles, sometimes even the meat if the unit was desperate enough, and then abandoned. In some sections of the front, the ground was so saturated with decaying horse carcasses that the smell made it difficult to breathe. Soldiers wrote about having to sleep near the bodies, about the flies, about the way the corpses swelled and burst in the heat. Unlike human remains, which were sometimes buried or collected, horse carcasses were left to rot. They were considered material, not casualties. There are no memorials for them. The scale of their death was so large that it became part of the landscape, just another feature of the battlefield, unremarkable and unrecorded. The ninth reality concerns the practice of live burial in collapsed trenches. Shellfire didn't just kill by shrapnel or concussive force, it collapsed trench walls, burying men alive under tons of mud and sandbags. In many cases, these men were conscious, trapped in small pockets of air, unable to move, calling for help that often never came. Digging them out required time and manpower that wasn't always available, especially during active fighting. The decision of whether to attempt a rescue was made based on tactical priorities. If the position was under attack, the buried men were left. If it was quiet, a few might be dug out, but only if it could be done quickly. Some men were buried for hours, even days, before being reached. Many suffocated before rescue arrived. Those who survived often suffered from severe psychological trauma, a specific form of claustrophobic panic that made it impossible for them to return to the trenches. There are letters from soldiers describing the sound of buried men screaming underground, the sound gradually fading as the air ran out. In some cases, men close to the surface could be heard but not reached in time. They died knowing people were directly above them, trying and failing to save them. This happened thousands of times across the front. It was routine. The 10th reality is about venereal disease and how it was weaponized. By 1917, rates of syphilis and gonorrhea among soldiers had become a serious operational problem. In some British units, up to 20% of men were infected at any given time. The standard treatment was painful, involved injections of toxic compounds like arsenic and mercury, and often didn't work. What's less known is that some commanders deliberately allowed or even encouraged contact with infected prostitutes in certain areas as a way to incapacitate enemy forces. There are German intelligence reports suggesting that French authorities permitted the operation of brothels near German-held areas where the women were known to be infected, essentially using disease as a strategic tool. The British did something similar in occupied regions. This wasn't official policy, but it was tolerated, and in some cases, facilitated. Infected soldiers were removed from combat effectiveness for weeks or months. The treatment itself caused severe side effects, including blindness, kidney failure, and neurological damage. Some men never recovered. Venereal disease accounted for more lost manpower than gas attacks in several divisions during the latter half of the war. It was treated as a discipline issue rather than a medical one. Men were often punished for contracting it, assigned to labor battalions or penal units, even though the infections were contracted in sanctioned or tolerated establishments. The 11th reality is about the use of flamethrowers and what they actually did to human bodies. Flamethrowers were introduced by the Germans in 1915 and were later adopted by other nations. The weapon projected a stream of burning fuel that could reach 15 to 20 meters. The psychological effect was immediate and severe. Men hit by flamethrowers didn't always die quickly. The fuel stuck to skin and clothing, continuing to burn even after the initial spray stopped. Water didn't extinguish it. Victims often ran, spreading the fire, screaming until their lungs were seared by inhaling superheated air. The smell of burning human flesh was described in multiple accounts as nauseating and persistent, clinging to uniforms and equipment for days. What's rarely mentioned is that flamethrower operators were priority targets. If captured, they were almost never taken prisoner. They were killed on sight, often in ways that mirrored the weapon they carried. This was understood by all sides and accepted. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in combat was measured in weeks, not months. They knew this when they volunteered or were assigned. The weapon was so hated that international discussions about banning it began during the war itself, but it continued to be used until the armistice because it was effective at clearing fortified positions. Effectiveness outweighed morality. The 12th reality concerns forced labor battalions made up of colonial subjects. Britain, France, and Germany all used laborers conscripted from their colonies to dig trenches, build fortifications, and carry supplies. These men were not soldiers. They were not armed. They were not protected under the same regulations as military personnel. The Chinese Labor Corps, recruited by Britain, numbered nearly 100,000 men by the end of the war. They worked behind the lines, but they were still exposed to shellfire, gas attacks, and disease. Thousands died. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves or not buried at all. They were paid a fraction of what European laborers received, housed in worse conditions, and given fewer rations. If they refused to work, they were beaten or shot. There are records of summary executions for disobedience carried out without trial. After the war, many were not repatriated. They were simply abandoned in Europe, left to find their own way home or to die trying. France used laborers from Vietnam, Algeria, and West Africa in similar capacities. The death toll among these workers is unknown because they were not included in military casualty figures. They were classified as civilian contractors, even though they had no choice in their recruitment and no ability to leave. Their contribution was erased from official histories. The 13th reality is about self-inflicted wounds and how common they became. Soldiers shot themselves to escape the front. They aimed for hands, feet, limbs that would cause injury serious enough to warrant evacuation, but not death. Officers were aware of this and developed methods to detect it. If the wound was at a certain angle, or if there was powder residue in a specific pattern, it was flagged as suspicious. Men caught with self-inflicted wounds were court-martialed. The punishment ranged from execution to assignment to penal battalions that were used for the most dangerous tasks, essentially a delayed death sentence. What's disturbing is how widespread the practice was despite the risks. In some units, particularly after prolonged combat, the rate of suspected self-inflicted wounds reached double digits as a percentage of total casualties. This wasn't cowardice in the traditional sense. It was a rational calculation. The odds of surviving a self-inflicted wound and the subsequent punishment were often better than the odds of surviving continued frontline service. Medical officers were instructed to report suspicious wounds. Some complied, others did not. There are accounts of doctors deliberately misclassifying injuries to protect soldiers they believed were at the breaking point. This created a quiet conflict within the medical corps between those who prioritized military discipline and those who prioritized the humanity of the men they treated. The 14th reality involves the systematic looting of corpses. Soldiers on all sides scavenged the dead for anything useful. Boots, coats, weapons, food, letters, photographs, rings, teeth with gold fillings. This wasn't considered dishonorable. It was survival. A dead man had no use for his belongings. A living man might need them to stay alive another day. The practice was so common that it was mentioned in training manuals, not to condemn it, but to warn soldiers to carry identification at all times so their bodies could be identified after looting. There are accounts of men checking bodies immediately after an attack, before the wounded had even been collected, looking for anything valuable. In some cases, wounded men were robbed while still alive, too weak to resist. This happened on all sides, in all sectors. It wasn't aberrant behavior, it was normalized. Officers sometimes participated or turned a blind eye. The dead were a resource. In the economy of trench warfare, where supply lines were unreliable and conditions were desperate, scavenging the fallen was logical. Morality adapted to necessity. The 15th reality is about the treatment of mentally ill soldiers after the war. Tens of thousands of men returned home with severe psychological trauma, what was then called shell shock or war neurosis. Many were institutionalized. Asylums in Britain, France, Germany, and other participating nations saw a massive influx of former soldiers who could not function in civilian life. These men were often treated with methods that ranged from ineffective to outright abusive. Electroshock therapy, hydrotherapy, isolation, and physical restraints were standard. Some were lobotomized. The goal wasn't to cure them, it was to make them manageable. Many spent the rest of their lives in institutions, forgotten by the governments that sent them to war. Their families received little to no support. The stigma of mental illness meant that many were hidden away, never spoken about. Veterans organizations rarely advocated for them because they were considered embarrassing, evidence that the war had broken men in ways that contradicted the heroic narratives being constructed. These men died in asylums, in poverty, alone. Their suffering didn't end with the armistice. It continued for decades, unacknowledged and uncompensated. The 16th reality concerns the deliberate destruction of medical records. After the war, many nations destroyed or classified medical records related to the treatment of soldiers, particularly those involving experimental treatments, psychiatric cases, and certain battlefield injuries. This wasn't about privacy. It was about liability. Governments did not want evidence of negligence, malpractice, or the true scale of long-term casualties to become public. In Britain, thousands of medical files were sealed or destroyed in the 1920s and 30s. The same happened in France and Germany. What survives is fragmentary. Researchers attempting to reconstruct the medical history of the war have found that entire categories of injury and illness are barely documented, not because they didn't occur, but because the records were intentionally eliminated. This has made it impossible to accurately assess the full human cost of the war. The numbers we have are incomplete. The real toll, physical and psychological, is higher than any official figure, but the evidence to prove it was erased. The 17th reality is about the use of soldiers for medical experimentation. With large numbers of wounded and dying men available, some military doctors conducted experiments that would not have been permitted in civilian settings. Testing new surgical techniques, experimental drugs, untested treatments for gas exposure and infection. Consent was often not obtained. Soldiers were subjects because they were accessible and because military authority overrode medical ethics in many cases. There are documented instances of this in German, French, and British medical units. The results of some of these experiments were published in medical journals after the war without mentioning that the subjects were unconsenting soldiers. This contributed to advances in trauma surgery and infectious disease treatment, but it was done on men who had no ability to refuse. The ethical violations were buried in the language of medical progress. The 18th reality is the prevalence of suicide among veterans in the years immediately following the war. Exact numbers are difficult to establish because many suicides were not recorded as such, either due to stigma or because families requested alternative causes of death on official documents. But anecdotal evidence, Newspaper reports and veterans organization records suggest that suicide rates among former soldiers were significantly elevated compared to the general population throughout the 1920s and 30s. Men who survived the war could not survive the peace. The reasons varied: chronic pain from injuries, psychological trauma, inability to reintegrate into civilian life, economic hardship during the post-war recession. What's notable is how little attention this received. Governments that had mobilized millions were largely indifferent to their post-war welfare. Veteran support systems were underfunded and inconsistent. Many men who had served fell through the cracks, ending their lives in obscurity, their deaths classified as personal failures rather than consequences of the war. The 19th reality is about the flu pandemic of 1918 and how it was made worse by the war. The Spanish flu killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people worldwide, more than the war itself. But the war facilitated its spread. Troop movements, crowded ships, unsanitary conditions in camps and trenches, weakened immune systems from malnutrition and stress. All of this created ideal conditions for a pandemic. Military authorities knew the flu was spreading through their ranks. They knew it was lethal, but they couldn't stop troop movements without compromising military operations. So the war continued, and the flu spread. Soldiers carried it from the front to hospitals, from hospitals to cities, from cities to the countryside. In some units, more men died of flu than of combat in the final months of the war. The decision to prioritize military objectives over public health was conscious. The cost was calculated and accepted. The pandemic was a direct consequence of wartime conditions, but it's rarely framed that way. It's treated as a separate event, a natural disaster, rather than a man-made catastrophe enabled by the refusal to stop the machinery of war. The 20th reality is that the war didn't end for everyone in 1918. Fighting continued in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia for years. The Russian Civil War, the Turkish War of Independence, conflicts in the Baltic states, uprisings in colonies, all of these were direct extensions of World War I, involving the same powers, the same weapons, the same tactics. Millions more died in these conflicts. They are often treated as separate wars, but they were not. They were continuations, the unfinished business of a war that destabilized entire regions. The armistice on the Western Front was just that, an armistice on one front. The violence didn't stop. It shifted, and in many places it intensified. The Treaty of Versailles didn't bring peace. It rearranged the map and created new conflicts. The war that was supposed to end all wars didn't end. It metastasized. These 20 realities are not the entirety of what was hidden or suppressed about World War I, but they represent a pattern. The pattern is this: industrial war required industrial management of truth. What the public was allowed to know was carefully controlled, not out of malice, but out of necessity. The war could not be sustained if the full reality was widely understood. So the reality was managed. Suffering was categorized, documented, and filed away. Death was counted, sorted, and justified. The machinery of war required the machinery of narrative control. What's disturbing is not that these facts were hidden. It's that hiding them was considered reasonable, normal, and necessary by the people in charge. The war became a system, and the system prioritized its own continuation over the individuals it consumed. By the time the armistice was signed, over 17 million people were dead, military and civilian. Millions more were wounded, displaced, or psychologically destroyed. The landscape of Europe was poisoned, scarred with craters, unexploded ordnance, and mass graves. And yet within 20 years, the world went to war again, using many of the same justifications, the same methods, and the same willingness to treat human life as an acceptable cost of strategy. World War I didn't teach the lesson it should have. It taught that mass death could be organized, managed, and endured. The war ended, but the logic that made it possible did not.